In this tutorial, we'll be learning the 2x2 tubular cast on for flat knitting when you have a number of stitches that's divisible by 4. So in this method, you're going to have knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, where your first set of stitches will be knitting and your final set of stitches will be purl stitches. There are different variations of the tubular cast on depending on how many stitches you're casting on and also if it's flat or circular knitting. So again, the specific version of this video is going to be 2x2, so knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, tubular cast on, when it's flat knitting and you have a number of stitches that's divisible by 4. And this little swatch that I'm showing here is going to be what the finished product looks like. So one of the benefits of the tubular cast on is going to be that the fabric goes down and it basically looks like it seamlessly rolls to the other side. Another benefit of this method is that it is incredibly stretchy, and it also just gives your project a really nice finished edge along the bottom, so it looks very professional when it's all done. So first I'm going to start off with all the materials you need to do this cast on, then I'll go through each of the steps, and then finally I'll show you how to cut out the waste yarn and what it looks like in the end. Down in the description box below you'll find a written version of the steps that I'm using in this tutorial. So if you want to print that out and follow along as you're looking through the video, or if you want to print that out to have with you while you're knitting your pattern, feel free to check that out down below. Also, leave any questions you might have down in the comments down below and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching. The materials you'll need for this 2x2 tubular cast on will be some waste yarn. So for this example, I'll be using this light pink color as my waste yarn, which we'll cut out before we're finished doing this tutorial. Then this will be my main fabric yarn, so whatever the yarn is that you're going to be knitting your project out of, you'll want to have that yarn ready. You'll need your knitting needle. So typically the pattern will tell you what size to do this tubular cast on in, and usually it's either the same size as the ribbing you're going to knit after it, or it's one size smaller than that ribbing. And you'll need a needle you can use to slip stitches. So I'm going to be using a cable needle. You could also use an extra double pointed needle if you have one of those. And then finally, to cut out the waste yarn, we'll need a pair of scissors. To use this cast on method, you're going to need to have a number of stitches in your ribbing that is divisible by 4. So for example here, I'll be having 16 stitches in my ribbing. So I'll have knit 2, purl 2 ribbing with 16 stitches total. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to want to figure out how many stitches we need to cast on with the waste yarn. So with our waste yarn, we're going to want to cast on not the full 16 stitches, but we're going to use this formula. So it's whatever the number of stitches we need to have in our ribbing is. So that's our X variable. So for me that'll be 16. We divide that by 2 and then we add 1. So for me it'll be 16 divided by 2 plus 1, which would be 9 stitches. And then from those 9 stitches we'll increase to our 16 stitches. And that'll be how we end up with our tubular cast on and the 16 stitches total. The first step is going to be to take your waste yarn, so here I'm using this light pink color, and you're just going to want to cast on the number of stitches that you calculated from the formula onto your whatever needle size you're using for the ribbing, or one size smaller if the pattern calls for that. So I'm going to cast on 9 stitches. And one of the nice things about this is you can use any cast on method you'd like. So my preferred method is going to be a long tail cast on, but you can definitely use whatever method you'd like, just because this is going to be waste yarn, so we'll cut this out in the end. There are my 9 stitches cast on. So now I'm just going to cut off the rest of the waste yarn. So I just have about maybe like 6 inches or so, just to make sure it doesn't unravel. And that'll be all we need the waste yarn for. So I'm just going to move that to the side. And now we're going to want to use our working colored yarn from here on. So this is going to be the color of the main fabric that you're working with. So I'm going to turn my work, and with my working yarn, I'm going to purl into each one of these stitches. So when you leave your tail, you'll want to leave about an 8-inch tail or so you can weave that in later on, or longer if you need to sew a seam or something like that. So I'm going to purl into each one of the stitches that I cast on with my waste yarn. So now I'm going to turn my work again. And here I just have my 9 stitches. So this is going to be the next step. The next row that we're going to do is going to be the one that increases it to the number of stitches we should have on the needle. So after I complete the next row, I should have 16 stitches on my needle. For this row, I'm going to first knit into the first stitch. And then once I slide that stitch onto the next needle, there'll be a bar right in between the last stitch I worked and the next stitch on the needle down here. So you'll see it's that peach colored bar. And I'm going to want to pick up that bar with my left needle going from front to back. Now with my right needle, I'm going to bring the yarn to the front and I'm going to purl into that bar. Now I'm going to bring the yarn to the back again, knit into the next stitch. Then again, there'll be the bar in between. So I'm going to pick up that bar in between, bring my yarn to the front, and purl into that bar. And I'm going to continue alternating between knitting, bringing the yarn to the front, picking up the bar, and purling into that bar until I have 2 stitches remaining. So what I just worked on my last needle was I picked up the bar in between and I purled into it. So now I'm going to bring my yarn to the back and I still have 2 stitches on my left needle. The next stitch I'm going to knit, and now I'm going to pick up the bar in between the last stitch I worked and the last stitch on the left needle from front to back, bring my yarn to the front, and instead of just purling into that bar, I'm going to purl into both that bar and the last stitch on the needle. So I'm going to purl these 2 together. So you slip your needle into purlwise into both stitches and then just purl that as normal. So at this point, you should have 16 or whatever number of stitches is in your pattern. So for me, it should be 16. So I do have 16 stitches on the needle. If you didn't have 16 stitches on the needle, the way you can check is you can just spread out your stitches a little bit. And what you should have, I'll point with my other needle, is you should have, basically there should be 1 stitch that's connected down to the scrap yarn, and then there should be 1 stitch that isn't connected down to the scrap yarn. So you'll see there's a hole in the scrap yarn right there. Then the next stitch is connected down to the waste yarn or scrap yarn. This one is not connected down here. So if you didn't end up with the right number of stitches, there's likely somewhere in the middle of your work where you're missing this extra one in the center. So there's somewhere where the bar wasn't picked up. So that's what you're going to want to look out for the next time you try casting on. Now that I finished that row, I'm going to turn my work again. And now it's going to be time to rearrange the stitches to get them into the knit 2 purl 2 setup. So the way they're set up right now, the first stitch is a knit stitch, and the second one is a purl stitch, then we have another knit stitch, and then another purl stitch. And how you can tell which one are knit stitches and which one are purl stitches is the purl stitches have the bumps on the front. So the second stitch in here has a little bump. Then this third stitch doesn't have any bump on the front, but this fourth stitch does have a bump on the front. So the ones with bumps are going to be purl stitches. And we're going to want to rearrange these stitches so we have knit 2, then purl 2 in a row. So we can do this by first slipping our first stitch onto the right needle And now the next stitch we're going to want to have is we're going to want to have a knit stitch. So we don't want this purl stitch yet. So I'm going to slip that stitch onto a cable needle, hold it in the back, and then I'm going to slip the next knit stitch onto my right needle. Now I'm going to slide that purl stitch that's on the cable needle onto my right needle, and then I'm going to take the next purl stitch from my left needle. So now it's set up where we have 2 stitches that don't have purl bumps in the front, 2 stitches that do have purl bumps in the front. Now we're going to repeat that same combination of slip stitches on the next set of 4. So I'm going to slip the first one, take the second one, hold it in back, slip one from the left needle, put the stitch from the cable needle on my right needle, and then slip one more stitch from the right needle, or the left needle, sorry. And we're going to do it again. Slip one stitch from the left needle, take the next stitch from the left needle, hold it on a cable needle in the back, slip the next stitch from the left needle, add the stitch from the cable needle onto the right needle, and then slip one more stitch onto the right needle from the left. And then finally, do the last set of 4, or however many sets of 4 you have on your needle. Here are all my stitches. So now I just need to slide them all back onto my left needle so I can begin working them. For the next row, and as part of our setup, what we're going to do is we're going to work in knit 2, then slip 2 purlwise. So I'm going to knit 2 stitches, bring my yarn to the front, slip 2 stitches purlwise, bring my yarn to the back, knit 2, bring my yarn to the front, slip 2 purlwise. And you're going to continue doing this set of 4 stitches until you have 4 stitches remaining. So now that I have my 4 stitches remaining, I'm going to knit 2, bring my yarn to the front, slip 1 purlwise, and then purl the last stitch on the needle. Now I'm going to turn my work and repeat that same row again. So I'm going to do the knit 2, bring the yarn to the front, slip 2 stitches purlwise, bring my yarn to the back, and continue doing that repeat until 4 stitches remain. With the final 4 stitches, you're going to knit 2, bring the yarn to the front, slip 1 purlwise, then purl the final stitch on the needle. Now that we've completed those 4 rows, we're going to go through, and now we can just begin working in our knit 2 purl 2 ribbing. So the cast on edge doesn't look quite as good as it could yet. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to work up a couple rows knitting knit 2 purl 2 ribbing, cast off those stitches, and I'll show you how to cut out this waste yarn so we can see what this cast on edge looks like. So I'll be back in a second. I've knit a few rows of knit 2 purl 2 ribbing now. So I'm going to go back and cut out my waste yarn down at the bottom. So you're going to want to make sure you cut out your waste yarn after you get about an inch or 2 into the ribbing, just to make sure your cast on edge is secure and that there weren't any mistakes in it. Because you don't want it to happen where you knit like the whole front panel of a sweater, only to find out that your cast on edge is unraveling. So here, how I cut out this edge is if you stretch it out, you see how these holes form in between in the waste yarn. So there's like these large holes that form. And what I do is I just put the scissors into each one of those and I cut through there. You want to make sure to take your time and make sure that you don't accidentally cut any of the actual working yarn. So now that I've done that, I can just go along the edge, and these will just, the waste yarn will just pull right out of the stitches. This is what it'll look like. And you can make sure that all your stitches are secure and just give a tug along the edge and make sure that everything's staying in place. Typically the stitch that makes people the most nervous are these ones right here at the end. So they actually are secure because you can pull on either one of them and the other one just moves a little bit, so they're wrapped all the way through. But what I usually do is I just take the tail of my yarn and I thread it through that one on the very end. And that way I can keep that one tucked in a little bit when I weave in this end all the way at the end. So just to kind of double secure that one at the end. So now you can see this edge is incredibly stretchy and it gives a really nice 2x2 cast on. And then if you turn your work, it's just going to move seamlessly into the other side. So it's a really professional, clean edge.